Hello everybody. In this video, we're going to dive into the different parts of Flexbox, starting with what Flexbox is and how Flexbox works. And then we're going to dive into the different properties that we can apply to Flexbox in order to lay out and style our elements as we want. So, to get started, let's add a div inside of our body, and we give it a class of Flexbox container. So this will be the container that all our Flexbox items will reside. Then inside of this container, we'll add another div and give it a class, and we call this one Flexbox item. And we'll also give it a class of Flexbox item 1, so that we know which item we're referring to when we style it individually. If you save that, you see that we have a gray box show up on the right here, and that's because I've already applied some styles to these Flexbox items so that we can distinguish them. Now let's copy this and add in 2 more Flexbox items and save that, and you see that we have now 3 Flexbox items instead of our Flexbox container, but we don't have any styling to actually make this a Flex container. So to get started with creating a Flex container, we are going to our styles here. We have our Flexbox container selector, and we can just say display and set it to Flex. And this is how we create a Flexbox container. Now if I save that, you see that all of our items are now the same height and they all show up in one row. You also notice that if I shrink our browser, you will see that these items will scale their size to fit within the browser, and as I make it wide enough for them to all fit, they will just show up on the left side of the screen. And this is really the main thing that Flexbox has going for. It allows you to style the flexibility and sizing of different elements in the container from the actual container selector here, this Flexbox container, without ever having to style the actual Flexbox items. So inside of this Flexbox container, you can do things such as laying out your different elements across the different rows and columns, as well as aligning them inside of that layout, and then the items themselves. You can specify how you want them to flexibly grow inside of the container, or how you want them to shrink inside the container. To make this easier to see, I've created some background styles here, and if we save this, you'll see that we now have our Flexbox container, which is this yellow background item, and then a different Flexbox items with their numbers in the corner as this grayish colored with a border that is a little bit darker gray. This way, when we shrink our browser, you can see that these items shrink together, and as we increase it, they will grow again. Now, before we get started with actually laying out and styling a different element inside of our container, we first need to understand the concept of the main axis and the cross axis inside of a Flexbox container. I have these tiles here that will show us the main axis and cross axis for our Flexbox container. And as you can see that this main axis goes horizontally across the entire Flexbox container, or the cross axis goes vertically. This is because our Flexbox container is laid out in a row as opposed to a column. Flexbox gives us a property on the container called the flex direction, where we can set if we want our Flexbox to be a row or a column-based layout, and depending on this, these main axis and cross axis will actually flip. So in a column-based layout, the cross axis will go horizontally and the main axis will go vertically. All you really need to remember is that this main axis will go the same direction as your layout. So in a row layout, it will be horizontal, and a column layout, it will be vertical. And in order to style the layout of these elements, we style them based on the axes. So the main axis or the cross axis are not based on vertical or horizontal. So if we wanted to style our elements on the main axis, we would use the justify content property inside of our Flexbox container. Right now, our main axis as FlexStart attribute applied, to which means that all the elements will align at the start of the main axis. If, for example, we wanted to center these items inside of this main axis, we would change this from FlexStart to center. And you can see that now all of our Flexbox items are in the center of our container. Another thing that we can do is, if we wanted to lay out our elements with space between them, we could use the space between property here. And now all the extra space inside of our Flexbox container will be put evenly between all the different items inside of our container. And if you wanted to have space on the outside of our container as well, we could use space around, which puts an even amount of space on all sides of the Flex items and not just in between them. This makes laying out items in a horizontal manner very easy inside of a Flexbox due to this justify content property. But if you wanted to, for example, lay out things on this cross axis, we would use the align items property, and right now the default for this is stretch, which means our items will stretch to fill the most amount of space vertically that they can. That's why some of our items that were smaller grew to full size. If we wanted to keep the size of our items, we would use FlexStart, and then all of our items would align themselves at the very top of our Flexbox container based on this cross axis. We could also use center here in order to center them vertically, which is one of the most important things that you can do with Flexbox. Before Flexbox, aligning items vertically inside of a container was nearly impossible. But Flexbox is as easy as one line of CSS, and it will perfectly align all of your items inside of this container. The last way to align our items inside of our Flexbox container is to use the align content property, and this property is only for use on multi-line Flexbox containers. But as you saw, when we shrink our browser size, these items just shrink to take up the amount of space needed. But if we change our Flexbox here to use the Flex wrap property and tell it to wrap, we'll see that our items will wrap on two different lines instead of shrinking their size, as you can see here. And this align content property tells it how much space to put between lines. For example, if we use FlexStart, all of our items will align up at the top of the container, while FlexEnd will align them all at the bottom of the container. An easy way to see this is if we add a height property to our Flexbox container. So if you put the height here and we just make it, let's say 700 pixels, now you can see that the FlexEnd for aligning content has made our Flexbox items all aligned at the bottom of our container. While FlexStart will make them aligned at a start, and this has very similar properties to justify content. For example, we could put space between here, and now we have space between our Flexbox item rows. And if we shrink this even further, we'll see that there is now even space between them as well, which is great. But align content is something I don't really use that often. I really justify content and align items are the properties I use most, since they align your individual rows along the main and cross axis. Now, let's revert that height back to the default. Get rid of our align content, justify content, align items, and wrap. So we just have a normal Flexbox container here, and we'll increase that size a little bit, and we'll also remove these accesses since we no longer actually need them. Now if we go back into our styles here, and let's say we want a column layout instead, we'll just use our Flex direction, change it to column, and now you see that different Flexbox items show up in a column as opposed to the different row. And if we use justify content and we say center, for example, you will notice that they don't center horizontally, and that's because they are centering inside of the column vertically. And if we put that height back onto our Flex container, let's make it 800 pixels, save that, and you see that now they are centered vertically. And that's because justify content is using the main axis, which in this case is column as opposed to row. If we use align items, we put center in here and save it. you'll see that now our items are centering horizontally because the cross-axis is horizontal inside of a column-based Flexbox container. Now we can revert all that back to normal. So we just have our standard Flexbox container here, and we can start to talk about the different properties. We can apply it to our different Flexbox items as opposed to the Flexbox container. As I mentioned, the container is really only for laying out spacing between your items as well as the positioning of your items inside of the container. The actual Flexbox item properties are meant to either override those positioning and layout properties or to apply different flexible sizing to these elements. As you can see by default, when we decrease the size of our browser, all items shrink in size. But if we wanted to prevent that on, let's say, only our item, we could go in here, use the flex shrink property and set it to 0 to say that we don't want it to shrink at all. And if we say that, you now see our first item does not shrink no matter how small our browser gets. But these other two items shrink together. We could also use the flex grow property if we wanted to tell our items to grow bigger. So if we increase our size here, we have all this extra space. Let's say we wanted our third Flexbox item to fill that space. All we would do is that flex grow to be 1, and now that item takes up all the extra space no matter what size of our browser. We can also use flex grow on multiple items. So let's say we want our second item to also grow. We can just apply it here. And as we increase our browser size, you see that they will both grow proportionally to one another. So that way, this item, the Flexbox item 2 and Flexbox item 3 are the same exact size since they have the same exact flex grow number. If we, for example, change this to be 2 and increase the size of our browser, you now see that our Flexbox item 2 is about twice the size of our Flexbox item 3. You will notice, however, that Flexbox item 2 is not exactly twice the size of Flexbox item 3, as you would think by making flex grow twice as big. But what all flex grow property actually does is to take all the leftover space. So if we remove this flex grow here, you see we have all this leftover space and it divides it between all the different flex grows. So if we have a flex grow of 2 here and we have a flex grow of 1 on the third item, Flexbox item 2 will get twice the amount of available space than Flexbox item 3 gets. So if we say that, you will see that this Flexbox item 2 has gained twice of the available space that was left over as Flexbox item 3. And the reason that Flexbox item 2 is not actually twice the size of Flexbox item 3 is because we have a width set on our Flexbox items. So it takes these 200 pixels and then adds the amount of available remaining space onto those 200 pixels. If you wanted to override that, we could use what is called the flex basis property. And this tells our Flexbox where to start growing from. So if we change this to 0, our object will imagine that it is 0 pixels wide when it starts adding an additional space to it. And if we did this for both of our items here and saved it, you'll see that now Flexbox item 2 is exactly twice the size of Flexbox item 3 because it started adding additional space onto them in a 2:1 proportion. So it added twice as much to Flexbox 2 as it did to Flexbox 3. But they had no starting point at all. They started at 0, which means that Flexbox 2 here is twice the size of box 3 when they started at 200 pixels. It still added twice as much space as Flexbox 2 as Flexbox 3. But they had a 200 pixel beginning size, so they were actually exactly twice the size of the other one. For the most part, Flex grow, Flex shrink, and the different justify content and align item properties are all you really need in order to create dynamic and complex layouts in either a row or a column-based container. But if you needed to override the cross-axis alignment of the property, you can do that with the align self property. And let's say we wanted our second Flexbox item to be in the center of the container instead of stretching the full height of the container, we can use that. And now you can see that this align self property overrides are aligned content of our other containers, and you can see that it aligns in the center here, while these other items are aligning stretch, and this can be applied to all of our different containers. For example, we could go up to our Flexbox item 1 here and make this one fix, and you will see that now this aligns itself at the end of the container instead of stretching, which is the default for our align items applied to our Flexbox container. The very last property that is left to talk about is the order property that can be applied to our Flexbox items. This allows us to change the order of our items inside of our Flexbox container without actually changing our HTML. So for example, if we wanted Flexbox item 1 to be our third item, we would change the order to 3 Flexbox item 2. Let's say we want it to be our first item. So we change the order here to 1, and then we change the order of this Flexbox 3 to be an order of 2. And if we save that, you can now see that our second item is at the beginning of our container. Our third item is the second item in our container, and our first item is the very last item of our container. And this is because we use the order property to rearrange the order visually of our items without changing the order in our actual HTML. This is a property I highly advise not using unless you really need it, because this actually messes up the flow for people using screen readers, since the screen reader will still go in the order of the HTML, which means that they will get 8 Flexbox item 1 first, Flexbox item 2 second, and Flexbox item 3 third. Even though the order of display is different from that, this also messes up when you're tabbing through different form items. For example, if this was an input element for a text box, our tab would go to the Flexbox item 1 first, and then Flexbox item 2 second. This also messes up when you are tabbing through different form items. For example, if this was an input element for a text box, our tab would go to the Flexbox item 1 first, and then Flexbox item 2 second, even though they are displayed in order where it should be 2 first and then 3 second. So that's why I highly advise not using the order property unless you really need to rearrange the orders visually without actually messing with the HTML of the document. And that's really all there is to a Flexbox container. For the most part, you just need to have a container that wraps your different Flex items. You give it a display of Flex to say that you are using a Flexbox container. You then use the justify content property and the align item property inside of your container in order to tell it how you want to align these items inside of a container. And then lastly, you can use the different Flex shrink, grow, and basis properties in order to lay out your items individually inside of the Flexbox container to grow or shrink, as you need a shorthand for these different Flex shrink, grow, and basis properties. It's just the straight up Flex property, where the first number is your Flex grow, the second number is your Flex shrink, and the last number is your Flex basis. This is a great shorthand property that you can use in order to apply all these 3 different properties in one line. You can also leave off the later properties, such as if we only wanted the Flex grow to be 1, we just put Flex 1, and it will intelligently assign the Flex shrink and Flex basis properties without us having to actually manually set them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something new about Flexbox and how you can use Flexbox in order to create dynamic layouts for your site. If you guys did enjoy this, please make sure to leave a like down below and a comment to let me know if there is anything else about Flexbox you want me to talk about in more depth in a future video for you guys. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.